Hallo Freunde, ist 10 Uhr, E-Mail und mehr, in Redmond, Washington und es ist Zeit für .NET API Review. Heute, wir haben keine Rot-Issue. Yeah, we have run out of red issues. It is amazing. But we definitely have stuff to fill a day, and if you have issues that you wanted to get in for .NET 8, not that we're running out of time, but there aren't that many marked that way, so you can start promoting things from future. All right. First up, we have issue 83141, immutable array, create unsafe of T. Sergio?
Hey, yeah, so basically the idea for this issue is that we currently have no like built-in way to go from like an array that you own and you know that nobody else has access to get an immutable array, which is something that might be occasionally useful to do. And the advice so far has been for people to just rely on the internal layout of immutable array, which just has a single field, which is the array, and just use unsafe as to cast from an array to an immutable array, which works, but we figured it would have been nice to just expose like a higher level API that people can just rely on to stop just hacking the type layout. And so Jan proposed to add this immutable collections marshal class, which for now would just have two APIs to go from an array to an immutable array, and then from an immutable array to just the underlying array if present. And the idea being that, of course, you would only ever use this when like you're creating the array and you're 100% sure that nobody else will mutate it. Otherwise, of course, things will can go wrong. That's the general idea.
I have a very stupid question. Is it conceivable that in the future, immutable array might actually, as an implementation detail, wrap an array segment rather than an array?
I don't think so. So like last I talked with like Steven and Jan about this, which is also why we just gave people the guidance of just using unsafe as to cast, is that realistically speaking, there's no way that the layout would ever change. So this is more just like exposing a friendlier API, if you will, so that you don't just have to hack the type layout yourself. You just get the runtime to do that for you.
Yeah,
Okay,
we basically
cool. So,
we effectively already promoted this layout by telling people to just use unsafe as. So it would be a big breaking change to do that.
Works for me.
Plus we already expose. Well, that wouldn't invalidate your question. We couldn't. We basically already rely on immutable array separately, just being a single field for things like thread safety.
Mm-hmm.
And wrapping an array segment, we'd almost certainly start to see issues of torn immutable arrays as these were, passed around between threads. So I think it's what it is.
Sounds good.
Jeremy, we can't see anything in Teams.
Working on it. There's the big annoying red bar.
Yeah, ship it.
Yeah. Do we have as precedence on any other types? Like the Marshall type?
We have collection marshal.asSpan for list.
Should we just put this on collections marshal instead of immutable collections marshal?
We could if we moved immutable array down to corelib.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Layering.
Terrible layering.
And I think we probably can't do that for what it's worth, since we would no longer be able to if we type forward an immutable array, we'd no longer be able to ship an out of band with the new things on immutable array.
Yeah. If only we had roles.
Yeah, so regarding that, just, out of more of a curiosity, let's say that we had roles or, extension everything or what have you in the future. Would we just add it to a type called collections marshal at that point?
I mean, we would still be defining a public type somewhere. We would basically just be saying, also pretend that it lives on that type over there. We'd be adding an extension static.
And in this case, I don't think it's too big of a deal because they're in the same namespace. So if you just do, collections marshal, you'll see both. It's not like some of the other cases where we had a split and they're in completely different namespaces, and one of them is like non-discoverable. So I don't think it's a big issue here. It's just it's a split that has to be a split.
Fair enough.
And just the point I was trying to make is I could certainly see us wanting to say, okay, yeah, we want to pretend that it lives on collections marshal, but we would still also be exposing immutable collection marshal because we'd have to put it somewhere.
Sure, it just sounds like something that we wouldn't really expect people to use because there would be like a friendlier syntax to get to it.
Right, we could have a GUID as the name.
Fair enough. You heard it here. Steve is promoting using GUIDs as type names.
And then, based on that idea, we could come up with some sort of common, like, object model for things.
Ooh.
Okay. I see what you did there.
Yeah. All right.
So one question I had is like, so what is wrong with unsafe? Is it just because it's less discoverable? Unsafe as?
And it's sort of encouraging this. It's undiscoverable, and it's basically it looks like an implementation detail that's being taken advantage of because it is.
That's what it said.
You can also very easily get unsafe as wrong. With value types, it's normally safe, but as soon as you start getting a reference type involved, including arrays, if you mistype the array or do kind of any bad thing, you can introduce GC holes or undefined behavior in the JIT and just generally mess things up.
Yeah, it has very few guardrails around its usage, and if this is a common enough scenario, we really should not encourage people to do risky things.
What does a null input array do?
It would just give you an immutable array with no array, so it would be same as doing default. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Immutable array has a difference between null and empty. It
Yep.
leaks.
Okay.
And in fact, it's relied on for certain coding patterns.
Fair enough. And the title so the original proposal was, putting create unsafe on the type, and now it's being put on the marshal. So I assume that is a thing that, for example, Steve, you're happy with?
Yeah, I'm much happier with the shape of the proposal as it stands.
Okay. All right. Going once. Twice. Sold.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I've started a stopwatch to see from now until when it takes Sergio to get his PR up.
I mean, this API was only added 9 years later, so I guess that's still about 10 years it took to get the API approved. So.
All right. Add support for catchx/SHA-3 20342. Do you want to do the talking, or do you want me to do the talking, Kevin?
I can start. First, I'll say don't let the scroll bar scare anybody on this one. It's really the same API proposal 3 times, of which 60% of the proposal is unsupported OS platform attributes. So this is for adding SHA-3 for .NET, and the general gist of this is it is SHA-2 but with a completely different implementation, but it is otherwise largely the same as far as API shape goes. For background on this, Windows is adding SHA-3 into recent builds of Windows. We have SHA-3 in pretty much, I think it's OpenSSL 1.1. So we have our 2 platforms supported needed that we want for crypto. And this is lighting up SHA HMAC for SHA-3. And at the bottom of the proposal, there is SHAKE, which is an entirely new thing, but we'll talk about that one later. The API of this is more or less exactly the same as what we have for SHA-2. And one of the unfortunate things with SHA-3 and SHA-2 is way back in the early 2000s when every platform, including .NET, all added SHA-2. None of them put in version identifiers in their name. It was just SHA-256 is implicitly SHA-2 256. SHA-2 384 is just SHA-384. So one thing that came up during this discussion was how do we differentiate SHA-3 256 and SHA-2 256? We can't go back and rename the old ones. So even though using underscores is generally not what we like to do in API proposals, I think this is the least bad decision that I could think of, as well as being able to, use the version identifiers in .NET. Like, I think a lot of other platforms, if they could, would use hyphens, but they don't. And we can't use hyphens for identifiers. So really, the first properties on hash algorithm name, they are strongly typed strings. They match CNG's identifiers. They use hyphens, so we use underscores. And that's just adding SHA-3 in there. Same thing with OAEP for RSA encryption padding. And then we move on to the actual hash implementations. And when I said the scroll bar looks a little bit scary, we have a SHA-3 256, a SHA-3 384, and a SHA-3 512. The API shape amongst the 3 of them is identical, except for, some of the differences of, like, say, what the static create returns or what their properties are, but all of, like, the general, like, names and identifiers and such are the same. So we can kind of conclude that one feedback for one will be feedback for the other 2. The only difference between the SHA-3 identifiers and was that throat clearing because somebody wanted to interject?
I think email was just clearing his throat.
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes I can get wordy, so feel free to interject. The proposals are more or less the same. The only addition that we have for SHA-3 in addition to SHA-2 is this is supported property, which is static. It can be used by new consumers to determine whether or not their platform even supports SHA-3. We have introduced this on newer crypto primitives and used the same name for, say, AES GCM or Cha-Cha 20 Poly 1305 and the ED 25519 proposal that we did a couple weeks back. This serves the same purpose of helping people understand whether or not their platform can use the new and shiny thing. Other than that, it's the same as SHA-2 as far as API surface goes. There's SHA-3 384. And there's the 512. And then now we've gotten down to HMAC, which again follows the same pattern of HMAC SHA-256, HMAC SHA-384, HMAC SHA-3 or HMAC SHA-512. They don't use the factory pattern. They use constructors. They take a key. Again, the only thing new on them is the static is supported platform guard to help people understand if their OS is supported. And like the hashing primitives, we also do the 256, 384, and 512 variants of this.
Yeah, I think this does have one piece of difference based off the other proposals is the HMAC types, for reasons, have constructors instead of the create method. And so this is the only place that we would have and is supported, static is supported that is tied to a constructor instead of tied to a create in crypto, right?
Yes, but...
Or no, I guess that, like AES-GCM is a constructor.
Yeah, and the symmetric ones are the same as well. So there is precedent for it, and it will help people still guide the right decisions. The constructor is going to delegate to some internal implementation provided by our, runtime that, will either work or not work according to supported. And it does also have static one-shots as well. Again, modeled off of our previous SHA-2 implementations.
Is the listing of attributes and guard attributes correct? In the sense that if we do decide to, for whatever reason, after .NET 8 ships, service this, because for, say, iOS gets support for this, are you going to be able to target the .NET 8 SDK with an iOS app and say, like, hey, if is supported returns true, call the constructor, even though I know I'm on iOS? Or is that all just going to fall down dead?
I don't follow.
So let's say that come November, whatever, we ship the .NET 8 SDK, and then in December, iOS announces support for SHA-3, and then we service the .NET 8 runtime and say, like, hey, we understand how to call into this on iOS, so if you download like 8.0.1 and target that runtime, everything will just work correctly. But we have all of these attributes on here saying unsupported platform iOS, unsupported platform guard iOS, and so on. So even come, December, January, assuming that all these things come together, if I have an iOS targeting application that's resolving against the .NET 8 SDK, is this type still going to be off limits to me, even though the platform technically does support it? Basically, it comes down to the attributes that are on here. Are they correct?
The attributes are correct. Yes, this is what we intend to ship. If hypothetically somebody, this is a scenario that we have not run into, to my knowledge, but I would say if somebody has, these attributes are exposed on the ref assemblies. If somebody builds this against a version of the .NET 8 SDK, which is unaware that iOS in the future gets it, but then ends up on a runtime which does end up getting there, it will probably just start working.
Right. I guess they would just have a bunch of compiler warnings that they would have to suppress. Right?
Correct. Or they would just build with a newer SDK that has the different ref, although I don't think there is, I don't think we would change the ref assemblies in a servicing release. But
we don't. Yeah, we very strongly tend not to.
Right. Okay. So we could make it work. They would just have to suppress the warnings anyways.
Okay, yeah, and that's all fine because there is a workaround to get them unblocked. It's just I'm wondering, like, if there is an is supported API that ostensibly everybody's calling, like, why have all of these OS specific attributes?
Right. Well, but that's that's what they're doing, and I think this will address a question from chat too. Like hash data says iOS is an unsupported platform. The is supported says it guards iOS. So if you've called is supported, you can call hash data without getting a warning, because it has said if this returns true, you're not on iOS. That could be actually be wrong, but because these match, it's if you call the is supported, you won't get a you haven't constrained your operating system warning. And is supported could return true on iOS later. These two attributes are just pairs to the analyzer to let you know, hey, you might get a surprise exception. Once you've checked the is supported, the surprise goes away.
Yeah, and if we do fix the runtime to make it work, and the SDK doesn't get enlightened about this because we don't service rep assemblies, then they can just suppress the analyzer.
Yeah, and again, I get all of that, but like looking at this, like looking at all of those attributes everywhere with the full enumeration of every operating system known to man, like this makes me think we designed the supported OS attribute feature incorrectly, because it really makes me think that all of these attributes should just say, I don't care what OS you're on, call is supported first. If that doesn't return true, don't call this. But maybe that's a separate conversation, and I'm derailing us.
I see what you're saying, where you could just hash data says, I don't care what OS you're on, whether or not I'm going to work is going to be determined at runtime based on what is supported returns.
Yeah.
So I'm with you on that. That's just not how those attributes work.
Yeah. And anyway, it's just, like I said, seeing the review here very strongly brings into relief for me that I think the feature is misdesigned. But that said, that doesn't, aside from the attributes, that doesn't impact, the review of the SHA-3 feature all up.
Okay.
I guess isn't the answer just remove the attributes from is supported?
Well, the is supported attributes are guards. They're not unsupported OS platform,
they're
attributes.
guards. I see. Got it.
They're the guards.
Yeah.
If we're really worried about this, then what we can do is just remove the attributes entirely altogether from everything. That means people won't get analyzer warnings when they're doing something that they may not be aware doesn't work on all OSs, but if the intention is to later gradually light it up on other platforms when we can.
I just missed the guard word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we do for the intrinsics, honestly. Like, we don't have guards on there. We just say, like, it's up to you to call this supported first. And if we wanted to have attributes.
Concept. We don't have the OS concept, though, for the intrinsics.
Yeah. True.
I mean, the problem really is the sheer number of attributes here, right? So if we were to remove the is supported method, would there be any downside towards just moving all of those attributes and making them part of the type?
The only hitch on putting them on the type is if you go, Jeremy, if you can go back up to the top of the class declaration for HMAC or something like that, we have these public constants that are not technically under the purview of unsupported OS platform. You can use those constants anywhere without having to check the platform. And I tried, you cannot put unsupported OS platform on the class and then negate it with supported OS platform on the constants. Yeah. The analyzer doesn't pick that up.
So how about this then? Immo, Jeremy, would it be possible to schedule just a review in the future for maybe like fixing this weird flaw of the attribute system, and then we'll just keep progressing with this review?
I mean, since it's scheduling, that's an emo question.
Yeah. Because like I think like in this room, I think everyone can kind of see the fact that like this design seems untenable.
Yeah, and the answer could be just that we don't paint OS stuff on any of the crypto things, and because it's not related to the OS, we just happen to know that on OS X it will always say is supported as false.
Yeah,
always meaning until Apple actually adds it to
Yeah.
public API, and once they do, we'll wire up the support and remove the things. But like, there is
Right.
nothing operating system-y about this. It's just we know what environments you're on where it doesn't work. We also didn't really encode the Windows minimum build stuff. I don't remember if that's because we didn't have the numbers at the time or because their support matrix is going to be weird on it and there's nothing we can key off of.
Right, it really does need to be feature detection rather than version detection. But just spitballing, like an attribute would say, you know, unsupported OS name of is supported or something, and then just splat that everywhere and you're good to go.
Well, I mean, I did have a
Sounds reasonable.
proposal at some point to have a capability-based API for this, but
Mhm.
we never really felt strongly enough to do it. I think the only reason to do it here is just the sheer amount of duplication that this forces, right? That doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
Do we actually know, does it bloat the metadata? Probably not that much, right? Because they're all internalized, right?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how this affects the size of the ref assembly.
Yeah, and it would be only the ref assembly, right? It wouldn't be the runtime. At least I would hope it wouldn't be.
I mean, you don't have to have the attributes in the implementation, but I think we're not going out of our way to strip it either, are we?
Well, in fact, we need it in the implementation. Otherwise, every time we run the update the ref CS, it'll remove them, and then you have to constantly struggle to put them back. So
Yeah, I'm generally in favor of keeping our API surface between source and ref as close as possible.
Okay.
all right, so are we saying leave them in for now? Are we stripping them out?
Leave them as is would
Okay.
be my preference, just because like it's the least churn here, but I think we do need to have a serious conversation on like the future of this feature, because we're attempting to use it for feature detection rather than OS platform detection.
Yeah, and Levi, to address, I think, where you're going with this, the actual implementation of is supported isn't going to look at, you know, what OS version are you running on. It's going to say, can I open a CNG handle with this algorithm identifier? Or in OpenSSL's case, it's going to say, you know, do I have an EVP SHA-3 256 available?
Oh yeah, and that's absolutely the right way to do it.
And on the Mac flavors, it'll say false.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay, we can leave those in for now, and we'll revisit that at another point. It sounds like is what we're saying there.
Yeah.
All right, so
Okay.
then we have HMAC SHA-3 384, HMAC SHA-3 512, and then
Okay.
Shake.
Now
Now
we
people
get
need to
the
pay
new thing
attention.
called- This is uncharted territory of new stuff. So one of the new features of SHA-3 is called a ZOF, or an extensible output function, where the amount of data that your hash can produce is basically how much do you want it to produce. So you can say shake 128 to go ahead and give me 256 bytes if you want. And they are still hashes. The only difference it really ends up being is instead of a predetermined length output of like 128 bits or whatever, you get to decide how much of it you want. So in SHA-3, there are two ZOFs that we care about and are exposed by our platforms called Shake 128 and Shake 256. And we start off with an abstract class for Shake. The implementation of why we're doing an abstract is because I could see that, you know, implementers may say, give me something that is a ZOF or that can speak Shake, and I don't care if it's Shake 128 or Shake 256. Also because the implementation of Shake 128 and 256 is going to be exactly the same. They just say, use this string as an algorithm identifier and use this one. Because this is new and we don't want to close the door on our ability to change things in the future a little bit if we need to accommodate other hashing functions and needs. The constructor for Shake is going to be internal. That means nobody else can derive from it. It will be only derivable by us. That gives us the ability to add more abstracts to this class later if we need to, and it doesn't close the door on us forever if we need to adapt this to other things as they become available later in other platforms. Maybe we'll need to add something for KMac in, .NET 9 or something. So we make our default constructor internal. As far as all of the API names go, it's basically a combination of incremental hash plus static one-shots, and instead of our usual span writing of try write, we just you either give us a length of how big do you want the hash to be, or we just fill a buffer, which is also inspired by some of our other APIs that do similar kind of buffer filling, like PBKDF2 or SP800 08. However much you want, we will just give it to you. And unlike all of the hashing stuff above, the unsupported OS platform guards are on the class because there is no reason for them not to be. We don't expose any consts that are useful outside of the class, like those hash size and bits that we wanted to protect. I did check and make sure that unsupported OS platform guard does work as intended when it's inside of a class where the whole class is supported by unsupported OS platform.
Can I stop and ask a question, Kevin?
Mm-hmm.
Which was the API that's filling as much as you give it? That's the get current hash on Shake.
A good example of that would be RFC 2898 derived bytes PBKDF2. I will drop a link to it in chat. So,
but it is the highlighted API that would do that.
Yes.
Right. So yeah, that's why there's the disparity between the array returning one where you give it a length and the span one, because the length of the span is the length that it will fill.
Don't we have? I guess I'm a little concerned just from a naming perspective. Like, we have methods that are either named this or very similar to this that write a fixed amount. This is going to write as much as you give it. In the other ones, you can give it an arbitrary sized span and it'll only, write the beginning. So if someone didn't realize that this was behaving differently, they might continue to supply it with, their array pool buffer or something, and they're going to be filling 4K of hash data. I'm wondering if that's a pit of failure we should try and avoid in some fashion.
So you would want the method name to be perhaps fill or something like that?
Yeah.
So break
fill
the
current hash.
So get current hash for the array and fill with current hash for the span writing one.
Something like that. I don't have it all worked out, but I don't know, it just feels too similar. Like it could easily be misused. If you disagree, that's fine.
I think that's a valid concern of somebody just passing in a, like you said, a rented buffer, not realizing that they're going to fill some power of 2 number of bytes in there, which is more than they need. I don't.
I'm just looking to see.
Derived bytes. There's the PBKDF2 static on there.
Okay, but that was
good.
that's a static, so it doesn't have the same as the get versus fill.
Like what do we call it on the thing that CRC32 derives from and XXHash3 derives from? What's that base class?
Non-cryptographic hash algorithm.
Yeah, that one.
I want to say that's just called get because it returns an int.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The get current hash that takes a span byte.
Yeah, but it returns int instead of void.
Sure.
I'm just, yeah. In all of the non-cryptographic hash algorithms that we have, they always, all the ones that we've added have a fixed output size for the instance. Right, so CRC32 is going to output 32 bits, so 4 bytes.
The documentation for get current hash just basically says it returns an int, and the return documentation is the number of bytes written to destination, which is always hash length in bytes. So, and okay, gets the number of bytes. Okay, interesting.
I mean, fill with current hash seems okay to me, honestly.
Right. So the question is, do we shear the, like, do we not make it an overload and we call the array when get, or we call it fill with current hash? What output length do you want? And it's a little wonky, but it's still an overload. Like, we can say we want to rename this one, and then the question is, do we cascade it to the other one?
Or I'm wrong, and the void versus int return is enough of a signal that there's something special here.
Yeah, because there isn't a hierarchy, so there's not a you took a an iCrypto algorithm and this one does a different thing.
So everything that derives from SHAKE will fill that destination.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, I do want to talk about the type hierarchy, but I don't know if now is the right time to interject. So I guess I will. I do not like primitives having any type of hierarchy to them. Like primitives as fundamental building blocks, like the way that I always see it is if you as a consumer want some type of abstraction over a fundamental primitive, that abstraction is up to you, the consumer, to build. We don't have an abstraction for AES CCM and AES GCM, for instance. Like, we don't have an authenticated encryption abstraction. Like, ASP.NET has one, but it's a very opinionated abstraction.
I understand that for modes of symmetric encryption, because I think trying to make modes of AES as, the mode of a symmetric function really changes your API shape. Really, all this is doing is what is, the bit size of your shake is the difference here. Let me, as an example, Levi, if you were redoing, if we blew up all of the cryptographic APIs that we had and we were doing them all from scratch, would there, in your mental model, be any kind of abstraction publicly visible between SHA-256 and SHA-384?
iDisposable.
iDisposable. Okay.
iDisposable. That is literally the only interface every single one of our cryptographic primitives would implement. They wouldn't have any abstract base class underneath them. They would just be iDisposable. That said, you could introduce Shake in the future if you want to as an abstract base class, and it would not be a breaking change.
Yeah, we did that for EC algorithm and on something. I try to balance, Levi, with what your concern is, and I do recognize that is a valid concern. And I am internally struggling with how to answer it in a way that makes myself happy too. With the internal constructor on Shake, because I do agree that I do not want this to be an abstraction that gets outside of our control, but the internal constructor means it is an abstraction that we control, and it can't be taken out of our hands and other people can use it.
So
But somebody
Is
could
the
still
I-
take a shake as a parameter, and that
yeah, like why
Is
would someone want to
slightly
do that?
weird.
What's a scenario for somebody taking a shake argument into their method?
I will say the word agility. As much as I don't like that word.
I'm holding up, a cross in holy water right now.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely places in the in the crypto stuff all up where it's been useful for asymmetric algorithm having export PKCS8, or it's been useful for take the implementation of signed CMS. It's read some stuff, figure out what algorithm you want, now pass incremental hash or hash algorithm or whatever of like somebody did the choosing, and now all that we need to say is go add some data to this buffer. And yes, you could build your own wrapper object on top of things and handle it that way, but sometimes polymorphism is the right answer. I don't know if it is here, but
I have very rarely seen polymorphism in crypto agility end well.
I know. That's why I'm struggling to answer this in a very satisfactory way. I do not feel emotionally attached to the shake abstract. If we want to get rid of it because we don't think it's useful, that's fine. We can.
I mean, maybe I'm the odd one out here, but like
No,
Yeah.
I promise my initial proposal for this, that before it ended up on the screen, it did not have this abstract there. And I managed to convince myself that it was useful with the internal constructor. But if we're still concerned that other folks are going to have APIs where they take a shake and make incorrect assumptions about that, then we can get rid of it.
would you consider an interface instead of an abstract class?
Yes. I just generally default to abstracts because we try not to introduce interfaces.
I was gonna say I wouldn't.
So for example,
now that I've said it, I want to say no. I'd rather get rid of the whole thing than have an interface.
So the reason I ask is if the scenario isn't that somebody needs to take a shake, but that they need to take an extensible output function, then you could have an IXOF, which just has a fill bytes with current hash and reset method. And then every XOF that we ever introduce in the future could also implement that interface, and that is the abstraction. That said, the reason that I tend not to like polymorphism and crypto agility is because if you are crypto agile, you need to do things like identify which algorithm you're calling into so that you can properly write like its OID or whatever identifier into the stream that you're encrypting.
Yeah.
And there's
Now that
nothing in this class that tells you that.
I am. You are pushing the pendulum the other way for me now. Now I think we need to get rid of the abstraction altogether, because with an interface, and this is true with the abstract class as well. Again, one of my other weirder iterations of this one, there was a Zoff abstract class as well, and I decided that we didn't need it because it was the same thing as Shake and it existed purely for polymorphic purposes, and if we ever needed to introduce it, we could. That said, one of the reasons why I don't like that API proposal that you just randomly threw out there for the interface is because consider something like C-Shake, where you need to start taking labels and context parameters as well. How would you fit that into like a Zoff?
It wouldn't be an IZOF, it would be an I different Zoff.
Well, that's the thing, and though is it would just end up being it ends up becoming the same problem that we have with modes of symmetric cryptography, like AES, where the the mode really kind of dictates the inputs and outputs, and I don't know that we would gain a lot of value from that kind of interface.
So since you're leaning toward removing the abstract class, would it be okay to remove it now and then add it in the future if there is demand for it?
Sure.
Jeremy, were you okay with that?
Yep. I already wrote that down in my notes.
Okay.
Okay, so we're getting rid of the shake abstract, and all of those methods are going directly onto the class. The protected abstracts are going away because they're just going to be private and not abstract.
And the disposable will lift.
And the protected, disposing pattern will go away. Yeah. And we're still keeping these sealed.
Yes.
Okay. That seemed obvious, but I just thought I would confirm.
Okay, so returning to the methods currently called get. In fact, I'll return to those before I copy and paste them so I don't have to change them twice. So do we want to change all the gets to fill with?
I don't know if we've ever used fill with. I think it would just be fill current hash, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, it feels weird.
Yeah.
Like,
You're not filling the hash, you're filling the buffer with something.
yeah, because previously the places that I can think of that we used fill was simply the entirety of the verb, like RNG fill. So random number generator fill the span, and fill current hash the span makes it. In my head, it says the flow is going the other way. That you get the span gets to load the current hash into the shake, and the width it says no. The shake is pushing it out to the span.
Okay.
But that's just, my brain network.
Data adapter fill. Perfect. There's the example we were looking for.
I mean, I see lots of things that just say fill.
Yeah.
And then some UI things that are using fill as a noun.
I am sympathetic to Steve's argument that people might be surprised originally, but it is something that you would notice the very minute you try using it the first time when it's giving you the wrong data. Like even a basic unit test would catch that you're using it incorrectly. So maybe it's not a huge problem in practice because I know we've used that argument for other things before.
Yeah, and the only other concern that I have with different names is some belief that they might do two different things.
Yeah.
Because typically in this scenario, even if Steve's point, which is, valid, we've kind of erred on the side of just using the same name and overloading, but it made more sense in those contexts before.
I mean, if the algorithm is defined to have a variable length algorithm, a variable length hash, and get current hash doesn't tell you how long it is, such that anyone using shake will be expecting to have to specify the length, or they won't know that it's 8 bytes or 16 bytes, so they will go looking for an int return and there isn't one, and they'll be forced to go read the docs to figure out, wait, how long is this? I guess from that perspective, there won't be too much falling off a cliff.
What if we made it int return and just return span.length? That way, we clearly tell you as the return value, this is how many bytes we wrote. By the way, we filled the whole thing.
We can.
We can, and we kind of did the same thing for the hash APIs where SHA-256 hash data statics one-shots will always return an int, and it just says, oh yeah, by the way, it always returns 32 for 256. So
Yeah.
I mean, a little bit of that
wonder-
is if we ever get around to being able to make like, iStatic hash algorithms so that you can add polymorphism with generics. But as of the current feature design of that, it costs us more than it helps anyone.
But I wonder if that would actually address Steve's concern, though, because like we would be explicitly telling you in the return value, this is how many bytes we wrote, and if you debug.assert or have some other check and it's not what you expected, then that tells you pretty clearly something's wrong at the call site. Would that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it addresses the how much data was written, not having to know, and it being similar to the other APIs. I still have a little niggle in my mind that, someone's passing in a really large buffer here, and they say, oh, I guess the hash size is 4K. Okay, I better do that in the future. But it's not a big deal. It seems like if you're using these types, you've explicitly signed up for these semantics. Like, you're not going to be reaching for SHAKE if you don't understand that it produces arbitrary length hashes. Is that a fair statement?
Right.
hopefully.
I mean, someone could be using SHAKE 128 because the doc says using SHAKE 128, but it would say using or use SHAKE 128 to produce a 23 byte hash, and then they'd be like, where's the number that I tell it 23? And
right.
And then
well, that's what the docs are for.
And then you get, well, it was the output length if you wanted the array, and you're like, no, I know about span and I care about perf. Where's the span? Wait, it just takes a span. Oh, uses the length of the span as the number of bytes to, right? So that would be the story of somebody who doesn't quite know that a shake is a variable thing and is looking for where the tuning parameter that the docs that told them to go use it in the first place said to go.
The other thing, and I'm just going to throw it out there and somebody can say, no, Kevin, that was a very bad idea, is the append data the get current hash that has a destination just also take an output length parameter as well. And if the destination is less than output length, then we do our normal try append data, return false or throw. And if the destination is bigger, then we just write, whatever output length is. We basically just slice it for them.
So I had thought about that too, but the reason that I don't like it is that it kind of punishes people who know what they're doing because it forces them to specify stuff that is redundant.
Yeah, and then we just have to check. Wait, you gave me two nonsense parameters, or two parameters that are relative nonsense. Because honestly, all it would do is just say destination.slice output length, and then call the real thing. But let them do that.
Yeah, I just for sake of enumerating all possible options, I would just thought I'd throw it out there, and it seems like everybody, including myself, agreed that's kind of weird.
So yeah, between returning int and returning void, I don't have a strong preference. It sounds like returning int would at least make it somewhat consistent with all the other stuff, but it is kind of useless. I still maintain that like the minute somebody tries to do interop, they're going to discover that like, oh, why is all the data I'm producing invalid? And then they'll, hit F1 on the documentation and see what the usage is. That said, we did have an incorrect, what was it, like HMAC SHA-512 implementation for years and no one noticed, so for whatever algorithm that was.
Well, I think that was broken in 2 and fixed by 3. And in fact, I feel like it was broken in like 2 preview and fixed in 2. So I don't think it was years.
Okay.
Are you talking about .NET Framework?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was fixed between some .NET Framework 2 in some service pack.
Yeah, it's the
It
weird
wasn't-
property of.
It made it.
Go ahead.
It made it to RTM because we have public API surface that is now obsolete. It's called produce legacy HMAC values.
Yeah. So
Where legacy meant somebody used the wrong const in the HMAC formula.
So it sounds like most people here would prefer void just because it pollutes the API surface less. Am I kind of reading the room correctly?
So I would agree, and so and here's a little bit of anecdotal evidence to reinforce that is, again, going back to the hashing one shots. When we added those, we added the int returning ones, and we know that SHA-256 always returns 32. And I did have a couple of people ask me, why does this return an int? I'm suspicious. Is there ever going to write less than 32? And well, no, the answer is always going to be 32. So for the people that do know what they are doing, when they see this int returning value and they're just they get suspicious of why it's there because they think the runtime may actually write less than what they requested. And they go, what do I do in that case? So from that perspective, void does make more sense to me because when we did it for the hashing one-shots, people were confused why they were there.
I get it.
Okay.
At the same time, we're very split minds on this. I don't think I was there, but didn't we just approve a new API on GUID that tells you how many bytes or how many character, whatever it is it wrote out, even though it's always 16? And
The scenario for that, I believe, was so that you could slice the output buffer and then keep going.
right, but it's an
That's
example
not a
of
scenario here.
right, but it's an example of it will always do 16. We documented it will always do 16, and yet we still added it so that
Right.
to clarify.
In the case of that hash algorithm, so in the case of the hash algorithms, it could, following, again, foofy words that got put in design guidelines to try and match as many patterns as we had done before we wrote them down. I don't think GUID has a public const that says that it's 16 bytes. And we could say with the hash algorithms that, it's void, it always returns see the const on the same type. And then the pattern of span writing things would be fulfilled there would be a way other than in your head knowing how big the thing is. So for int, we have, int.write bytes, or, a thing that writes an int into a byte buffer, it writes size of int. You can write an easy programmatic guaranteed it did the right thing, you got the right count. And similarly, it would be, so there's the const of it wrote exactly what this const says, read the const if you need the number, or write 32, write 32 if that's what you want. But so
I recall one of the arguments as well.
That's the foofy pattern.
Well, I recall one of the arguments that we had for GUID also being like, if you have something that's doing source generation, for instance, if GUID follows the same pattern as all the other primitives, they don't really need to special case it. They could just say, read the return value, slice, keep going.
Right, and really that was about the
if statements.
Yeah, and that was about the try version, not the just shut up and do it version.
Yeah, correct. I don't see that same scenario playing out here. Like, I don't see source generators, for instance, calling this API and then trying to slice.
Right. Returning to the reference that I made of a static hash algorithm, when coming up with the proposal for SHA-3, I actually tried to introduce one, but found that things just the feature is not there yet with the way that the dims and the inheritance and saying the type wants to publicly expose the member but use the dim body, and it just wasn't there. But one reason for having all the static things return the int of how much they wrote is so that it would fit into a static pattern. Of course, the interface static could say it returns an int and the instances are void and they make it work with when I'm being used by the interface, here's the explicit implementation. But
yeah,
it doesn't really apply here in the shakes.
Another argument that's making me lean more toward void is people, if they don't know what they're doing, really should not be using primitives. They should be using something that's a much higher level abstraction. If you're calling this type, it's assumed that you know A, what its capabilities are, and B, like how to use the underlying algorithm correctly, including when it's appropriate to do so. Like if you don't know both of those, then you should not be calling this API. And that makes me think that this API really should be targeted toward, you know, people who understand this. So we should just embrace that.
Yeah, I'm slightly fence straddling, just because I was looking. There are places that we have already said, you know, we'll use the span input as a length, but that's things like AESGCM encrypt, where it's the size of the tag buffer you give us is the size of the tag that we're going to write. It doesn't use a verb called
Bad
get.
example.
Right. But it doesn't use the verb get. And
Right.
so this is, we have get current hash in one place and get current hash in another, and they behave similarly and differently, and I'm torn between, are they similar enough they should keep the same name, or are they different enough that they want different names? And I think maybe int get current hash might be the worst of the three. That it should be void get current hash, or we should change its name. But I can really be convinced to any of the three.
Yeah, and I've talked myself out of an int returning one. I've also talked myself out of fill. So that makes me vote on this proposal as being the one that I think is the cleanest of all the different options proposed. Or at least the one that's less hostile to the users that we intend to target this API toward.
Mm-hmm. Tanner, Stefan, Immo, you've all been quiet on this. Do you have any opinion?
For which particular question? The general shape of the API or this particular issue you just talked about?
Void get current hash, int get current hash, or void fill with current hash.
Can you repeat those?
So the top three.
Everyone checks out during crypto hour.
Yes, the top three contenders are what's written of public void get current hash taking a span. It will fill the span. The span's length is an input. Or say change void to int and it returns destination.length. Or change get to something like fill with.
I think so. Returning int is better overall, in my opinion. It's not going to hurt the perf or anything else, and if people don't want it, they can just discard the value. But otherwise, it is there, and it is then consistent with all the other APIs that return the number of bytes written. Otherwise, I think explicitly naming it fill. That way, it's very clear that it is filling the entire span given is the next best thing.
The downside to returning int is what Kevin had mentioned a few minutes ago, which is customers who know what they're doing are confused by the return value.
Customers who know what they're doing are going to be able to read the docs and quickly figure it out. People who don't know what they're doing
should not be
likely
using this API.
But they will anyways.
Right. Well,
I mean, there's something to be said for consistency, right?
Yeah.
Like with the rest
I
of
think,
.NET.
Yeah, I think we should either be consistent and return the int, or we should explicitly call it like fill. That way, it's so option B or C. I don't like option A of as proposed.
I don't think the int's that confusing either. I mean, we just did it, right, for GUID. I think that's what Steve said earlier.
Right, but GUID.tryWrite bytes doesn't write. It doesn't use the input of your span as a parameter. I mean,
Sure.
it's false if it's too short, but if you give it a 4K buffer, it says true and outs 16. This is, if you give it a 4K buffer, it runs the computation of 4K, and if you give it a 4K plus 1, it does it at 4K plus 1. And there's no answer that's too short, and there's no answer that's too long. Destination.length is an input.
Then I think fill is maybe the better thing. Then it's not returning int, but it's very clear that it is always writing everything into the buffer. And the only thing that could fail is an exception, in which case we'd then have a try API, which we don't.
Right. Okay, so then it's fill or fill with, and do we rename the array returning one with it?
I wouldn't rename the array one. Like, people are used to the word get. It creates something. Like, get seems to be the right terminology. Or you have someone allocate their own array, and then they fill the array. At that point, they take the array's input.
I do think that we, for most consistency throughout all of the crypto APIs going forward, we usually always have at least a byte returning one somewhere. Otherwise, we need one that takes a byte array and then has, like, offset in length or something like that. I would expect there to be one that returns an array and takes an int. Based on what I've heard, I think from my personal perspective, I like get current hash as is, and change the get current hash, leave it void, and change it to fill current hash. Whether or not with is in there is beyond the level of detail that I feel strongly about.
Okay, let me doodle this so it can be on screen so people can stare at it.
Yeah, I think fill with reads better.
I agree.
Emo, do you
Now,
are you upset by
to-
get and fill being
I mean,
a
I don't quite understand
spanified
the difference.
variant?
To me, fill is kind of implies some sort of like generation of stuff. But I guess you're computing the hash and you write it out, so I guess that works. I mean, we are not very consistent with our use of get and fill, so I think I don't care too much.
To wonder if there's any alignment here, we also have all of the static one-shots in here. They also do the same thing. Like, if you look on line 602 of Jeremy's screen, or 599 or whatever, very similar thing. They are static APIs that instead of instantiating SHA or SHAKE 128, you just say, I don't need an instance of this because I don't need to incrementally append data to it. Hash data as a name, that came from all of our other static one-shots on both HMAC and SHA. So would we call this something different, or do we think that hash data is straightforward enough, or does all of our naming that we've previously been discussing kind of fall down when we start considering the one-shots?
I think what's on screen is okay, honestly. I don't feel the need to complicate what's highlighted on the screen right now.
I was gonna say, you better not be happy with what's on the screen, since it has a get, a fill, and a fill with. Like, one of
the highlighted line,
yes.
Right? 599. That's what Kevin had asked about, right? Unless
Yeah.
I misunderstood the question.
I think we're just having too much fun now. Okay. I agree. I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the fact that we do have the static versions of this, which we haven't talked about yet, but they have the same API shape of here's a buffer and go fill it with some hash stuff. And it returns void.
Yep. Yeah, I think many good points have been made, but with the doodle it out and look at it, I think I like it as originally proposed best.
I agree.
Especially if emo has a shrug feeling of we're not super consistent of when we decide to use the verb fill. Fill, I think, always means fill, but
I think in this case you could make it. I think I would prefer the overloads because it's kind of just it does the same thing. It's just the mechanics of how it does it are slightly different, which I think is generally better. The only downside is that you need to be very sure that it's always unambiguous for overload resolution, right? But I guess that's true here.
Yep. Int and span of byte don't conflict. Okay. Since you called this the worst option, Tanner, are you okay?
I'm never going to use the API.
Good man.
I trust other people to write my crypto code.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right.
Do we have anything else left to discuss about the shakes? And then we have another shake with 256 in it. We didn't really talk about the one-shots specifically, but they're modeled off of the one-shots that we already have on the various hash APIs. So we have them that take bytes, that take spans, and we have async versions that take streams.
Yeah, that seems pretty standard.
Okay, so because apparently I'm a glutton for pain, I will point out that the let's call it the branding name of the shake algorithm is written in all capital letters, though it doesn't really actually stand for anything. So the proposal here is we said since people say shake as the word, and with AES we decided lowercase e and lowercase s were correct. So we went lowercase here, even though it. I assume that the CNG const is all caps, but the CNG algorithm identifier is all caps because they're an all caps language.
Yes.
But yeah, so this is
Lower, yeah.
the word people say, but it doesn't match the casing in the docs. But I think this is the right name, but I'm just opening it up for anybody who wants to disagree.
No, I think you're right. What we had been doing lately is we had been doing like trademarks and proper names as whatever the proper capitalization is, but everything else just gets regular like acronym style casing. It has led to a few unfortunate situations, like the UTF-8 class having a lower TNF, which I don't think people expect, but it follows the guidelines. That said, what's on screen reads nicely. And there's something very pleasing about that.
I personally think we should just generally follow our conventions, even for trademark names. There's so many trademarks that get changed over time between casings as well. Like, it's entirely inconsistent what the right thing is at any point in time. So the best thing is for us to just be consistent with our own normal styling convention.
and not consistent with whatever just pleases us the best.
I would hope that being consistent with our normal capitalization rules would make us happy.
Yes, it's, you know, RSA. I even put the note in the book that it's like it's named wrong. It should have been little s, little a, but
Yeah.
These SHAs are, because the current SHAs used capital letters, these did too, so we don't have, some of them are capital and some of them are lowercase in the same namespace.
In ASP.NET Full Framework, we had a type that was an IIS specific type, and it ended up with an uppercase first I and then a lowercase IS right after it, and it just looks weird.
Monsters.
Yeah.
All right. So from all this thing, we discussed the OS. I just called it OS guard because either way, we're going to leave everything as proposed, but there may be a follow-up and we just remove them or invent a new feature or do nothing and leave them as is. We did actually make a change from the proposal. We removed abstract class SHAKE, and so now we have SHAKE 128 and SHAKE 256. Don't have base classes. They're idisposable, and they just have a big block of instance stuff in the middle, which, yay, I got the same one twice. And then we had the long discussion about these three letters and left them as is. Anything else?
No, I think I'm happy.
If you've left API review happy, then we've done something wrong.
Okay, did
I'm
this
miserable.
post or not?
Okay, good. Good.
Okay, so it obviously posted. If any GitHub employees happen to be on the call, qua? I feel like
no
this
idea
happens
who
if I
can that
leave
be.
things in preview when I hit update. Or hit post. Yep. So it's the preview pane's broken. Alright. Thank you, Kevin. Alright,
Just
everybody
to
can
ask,
wake up
do
now.
you have any browser extensions installed that alter GitHub's behavior?
I don't. I might still have a stylish for GitHub,
Okay,
but that would just be a
I've-
CSS
I've-
override.
Yeah, I've seen this. It doesn't post issue a couple times on API reviews, and I'm just
You're suspicious it's me?
thought I'd ask. No, it happened to Emo too a couple of weeks ago, and okay. Anyways, moving on.
All right. Zip file, create from directory, allow it to write to a stream. Oh, from directory, not to directory. Wow, that's a really low number. 1555. I didn't.
Hey. Hello.
Hold on,
Can
one
you hear
moment.
me?
Yep, bookkeeping.
Yeah, we
All right.
can hear you, Carlos.
Thank you, internet.
Cool. I hope everyone is doing well today. So I'm here to propose adding stream-based method overloads for extracting and creating zip files. The request makes sense from the perspective that the methods take a path to a file, but internally they load them into a stream and then create a zip archive from that stream. So if we are able to handle a file stream, we should be able to handle other types of streams. And for these reasons, the implementation is fairly straightforward and reuses most of the code. The methods have the same parameters aside from the stream, one that substitutes the string for each case. And we already have precedents of similar methods making sense and working fine, because we added them to system format star file. I already explored implementing these methods, and I didn't find major roadblocks. The main thing for me is to add edge case scenarios for different types of streams, especially unseekable streams. Although whatever these new methods should be able to handle would be the same that zip archive is already able to handle. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share. Does anyone have any questions?
Scenario seems fine. For unzipping, is there a concept of like the entire stream contains a compressed file? Or is it like you read up until you reach like the end of tar marker and then you leave the stream in that position? Like, is it possible for a stream to contain like tar1, tar2, tar3, and so on? Sorry, zip 1, zip 2, zip 3, and so on.
That's a good
zips
question.
can't be
I haven't
concatenated.
looked at that.
Correct.
Well, the zip.
Because you go to the end of the file.
Yeah, the zip header is a footer, so you have to seek to the end. But these aren't extracting. This isn't reading; it's just writing.
Oh, the second one is.
Yeah,
if
the
you scroll
second
down,
portion, the unzipping ones.
Oh,
The
you
title
have
is
multiple
incomplete.
proposals.
I forgot to change it. Yeah.
Okay, so it
well,
sounds like
the
a
zip header
non-scenario then.
indicates the files. The zip header indicates the files that are included in the archive. So, I would expect that we are able to handle only the files that are indicated there. But I should add a test case to make sure that we don't keep reading unexpectedly, similar to what we did in tar.
Well, but that's the like zip requires a seekable stream because you have to go to the end and then read the last like 128 bytes, which tells you how many bytes of header footers there are, and then each header footer tells you, header tells you where the bytes were in the stream relative to the beginning. So
yeah,
so zip is the whole thing.
Another issue that we currently have in zip archive because we load the into memory the archive to be able to read this. This is especially bad for unseekable streams. So that's why we also have a separate proposal, which we eventually will explore, to add forward only zip reader and zip writer classes, similar to what we have in tar, so that we are able to handle that in a better way. Although the difficulty is, yes, like you said, if we have stuff at the end, we're going to have to read the whole stream. So it's possible that these extract methods won't be able to handle in the most efficient way the unseekable streams. But whatever we can do with zip archive, these methods should be able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, if zip archive's taking a stream and working, I assume it says if it's not seekable, it wraps it in a seekable stream or wraps it in a memory stream or drains it into memory stream or whatever, because zip is a read from end, and then read from end with offsets from the beginning, if I recall correctly. So it uses both ends of the stream, so it needs random access.
Right. So it wouldn't be an unexpected behavior. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah. Yeah. As these are just taking stream source and stream destination instead of the string path of where it should put a file, seems like an easy approve to me. Anybody have a disagreement?
Only with the namespace. It should probably be in system compression.
No, it should be in system IO compression, but I fixed that.
Oh.
My bad.
Close enough.
We're talking about adding new methods here, not about adding a brand new type.
Or top level namespace called compression.
Or top level namespace, yes.
Yeah, thanks for fixing that.
Boom.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Add a string marshalling property to generated com interface attribute 84662. I'm guessing
Oh
Jeremy.
man, Jeremy's here. That means we actually need to do this.
Oh, it's
Jackson,
easy.
if you
Jeremy will
want,
walk
you
us
can-
through it.
Yeah, I was gonna say Jackson can take over if he wants, but I can give the basics and he can go into more specifics.
Oh, sorry, Jackson. I didn't see you were here.
Yeah. Basically, for library import attribute, we have string marshalling and string marshalling custom type on it, so you can say use these string marshalling rules for all as the default rules for all the string parameters and return types and all that gunk on the library import. For generated com interface and that whole story, you put the attribute on the interface, not on the method. So we don't have anything at the method level to specify string marshalling. So we want to put it on our regular trigger attribute. So you can say, for all the methods on this interface, this is the default string marshalling rules, which is usually consistent within an interface.
So, according to Emo's metadata, library import string marshalling custom type is nullable, which seems like it should be the case here as well.
Yes. Basically, we're just copying and pasting the same properties. And then there's some rules around inheritance that we had talked about that I think Jackson knows better than I because he was in the conversation, whereas I was just part of the initial proposal.
Yeah, we were discussing whether or not we should implicitly copy the same string marshalling rules from the base interface to any interfaces that inherit from it. We thought maybe it would just be best to require like explicitly the same string marshalling for the entire hierarchy of the interface or of the interfaces. So if the base has UTF-8, all inheritors need to have UTF-8 as well.
The main rationale behind that is usually within an API family, it's either all UTF-8 or all UTF-16 or all B-SIRs or something like that. Like it's usually all the same thing within an API. And then if there's like one or two weird ones, you can always put a marshal using attribute on that specific parameter to change it to whatever it needs to match.
I mean, the inheriting probably makes sense, but is always potentially confusing. So I don't have. I'll trust whatever you guys want to do.
Let's say we're going to explicitly require that you put the same thing as the base interface, and then we can loosen that in the future based on customer feedback.
Would it? So if just thinking of what you said and the implications thereof. So if you had, I some com interface and it was extended with I some com interface 2, and the base one was UTF-16 and the 2 added some methods that did UTF-8, you still have to say the interface is UTF-16, but then you go paint the methods as actually this one's UTF-8?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the current proposal. Because that happens extremely rarely that you directly extend the interface and just have UTF-8 copies of all the UTF-16 methods. Usually you pick an encoding and you go with it.
Also, the generator is going to generate shadowing methods for each of the inherited interfaces. So that might be confusing when there's a generated method on the inherited or on the inheriting interface. If they're different and the original base method was UTF-16 and then the deriving interface was UTF-8, but then it would just kind of confuse things, I think.
I mean, I agree. It seems weird that. Yeah, it seems weird. I was just saying it out loud to make sure that if that degenerate case came up, that was the answer. So there is still a string marshalling that you can apply in the interface method decal.
So basically on each parameter, you can put marshal using to override that particular parameter or return type marshaling, which is what we have today. Just regular marshal using and specify the marshaller type. This is our accelerator shortcut, like what we did on library import.
Right. I'm just, because this is using interfaces and because COM and the generator, do they put, so if you put a marshal using on like my highlighted mod add symbols here, the attribute applied here on the interface method decal will matter. I'm just
because
making sure that the interface into the generator, into the output, that all of the interface attributes are being applied to generated output code. So
yes,
okay.
The attributes on the interface method, the interface methods are the source of truth. So that's where we pull all of our information from, because there's nowhere else to pull it from.
All right. Yeah. Sounds reasonable to me. And no one else is talking. Whoa.
It's everyone goes silent during the Jeremy crypto hour. Everyone else goes silent during the Jeremy interop hour.
That seems to be the pattern.
Also, the other Jeremy IO or other Jeremy, same other Jeremy, when he's being WinForms.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, just no one listens when Jeremy talks.
Or everyone's always listening and has nothing to say.
Yes. We're all awestruck, stupefied by the knowledge being rained down upon us.
Cool. All right. That solved the promised itinerary, so I will take 20-minute nominations. I think this is now officially the longest that I've said I'm open for nominations, and Tanner hasn't proposed something.
We're actually out of all my proposals right now. I have to build back up a backlog. But no, there's a couple collection ones there that look like they might be fairly straightforward.
Apparently, I'm just being a bad MC today.
Do you have particular numbers?
Thank you, Internet.
They were on the list. So the read-only capacity, the hash one should be straightforward, and the 2 dictionary that turns an enumerable of key value pair should be pretty straightforward, I think.
Okay, they both take 2 hours now, because you said it.
Yep.
Where's the hash set count?
2 down.
Okay, well, this one got opened first.
Yeah, it's just another extension method on enumerable, but this takes key value pair and value tuple and allows you to just create a dictionary from them.
Yeah, I mean, presumably we would, not that it really matters, but instead of calling it value tuple of to key to value, we would use the named tuple syntax and call it to key key and to value value.
Yeah, probably. That sounds better.
And this time I will make the changes that I said, instead of just say the changes.
Right, are we missing an overload here?
Yeah, so does anybody know why we don't have a I-equality comparer off or with the key value pair?
I think that may have just been, so Fowler's not here to explain, but I think it was just an oversight.
Okay, I mean we could
Doesn't key value pair have its own comparer?
it's just
No.
it's just the two tuple.
Yeah, I think it's just an oversight, honestly.
Yeah, because the scenario would be if you wanted to, I mean, scenario is you have an existing dictionary and you want to make a new dictionary, but with a different comparer. So you just be like, dot. No, you just wait on the dictionary. Yeah, because there's no property that you give the key value pairs. It's just it is an enumerable of key value pairs.
Yep.
Yeah, we can add it. If it actually doesn't make sense, then somebody can always not implement it. Where is my cursor?
This means that, doesn't this mean that dictionary is going to have a two-dictionary extension method hanging off of it then?
It already does.
Does it?
It's an enumerable.
Yeah, but I didn't think that it actually fulfilled any of the other two dictionaries. Oh, it does, yeah. Enumerable of, okay, yeah. You have to give it a func. That's
Yeah.
what it is.
But
Okay.
yes,
Yep.
IntelliSense will already give you dictionary dot to dictionary. Now it'll just give you
Okay,
more.
Yeah. Now it'll give you one that has no other arguments. Perfect.
Apparently I hit.
Which is a cool and easy way to clone a dictionary, I guess, as long as you don't care about persisting the comparer.
We also have list to list, don't we?
Yep.
Which will properly clone the list.
All right, and is the so key not null matches the current to dictionary, so I assume it's right.
So I'm going to ask a really dumb question, which is, should the overloads that don't take a comparer check to see whether this parameter is itself a dictionary, and then if so, pull down the original comparer? Basically persist it. Because otherwise what's going to happen, potentially, is that you have a dictionary of key value already, and then you do, in your little editor, dot to dictionary, open paren, close paren, and you have what ostensibly appears to be a clone, but with a different, potentially a different actual behavior under the covers. Because the comparer did not get persisted.
I understand the premise, but I think the issue is we can't do it for any iDictionary.
Right.
We can only do it for the proper dictionary type, in which case it then becomes inconsistent to do so.
Right.
Yeah. Unless we just preempted it with adding a two dictionary overload that took, this dictionary, or put a two dictionary instance method on dictionary. So yeah, I think it would just treat it as key value pairs, and it just sees it's enumerable.
and that's all fine. I'm just wondering if are people going to use this potentially as a way to clone the dictionary, and if so, might they be surprised when it actually results in not a clone, but something with potentially a completely different behavior under the covers?
Yeah, potentially.
That's my only concern.
I think they could be, but we have the overload to let them do what they want.
Would they know to do that? That's the thing.
No.
We can make sure the docs have it, and then they're not going to read the docs, and they'll come to Discord, and we'll tell them there instead.
I just don't want to create a potential pit of failure. That's
Yeah.
my only concern. But if it sounds like we don't think people are going to run into it, then so be it.
I'm sure someone will run into it. Someone runs into everything.
Then maybe can we at least like just add a note to the review here, saying like, hey, by the way, this does not actually make a clone. This does not make a behaviorally identical clone. Like, we need to change docs or something in order to call that out. Like, I don't want to let, perfect be the enemy of good, as it were. It's just like, I just get nervous about stuff like this.
Does that cover your...
Yeah, that's totally fine. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Any other input? Scrolling chat, where they're talking about key value pair versus value tuple, and I think everything's covered. So if I missed something from chat, I'm sorry. Just assert it at me again. Wouldn't be the first time this review that I've had to come back to something because chat pointed out I was silly. Alright, add read-only capacity property to hash set and dictionary, and add trim access to hash set.
Right. So we have capacity, or we have things that advertise the capacity on other types. I believe on dictionary we even have a set capacity method. However, there's no way to see what the current capacity is, to know, for example, how long until resize is going to happen.
Ensure capacity.
Yeah, that's the name. I was looking for it, and I'm like, Q has set capacity. Speaking of Q of T does not expose its capacity either, but it does have the set capacity method. And stack of T is also the same way. Except it's also called ensure, so Q is odd by calling it set.
Right, because the ones that are ensure are saying they're free to ignore the number if it's smaller. I don't know if set is guaranteeing.
That would make sense.
Is there like a going out of business sale at Bed Bath & Beyond? Where'd everybody go?
I mean, we're still here.
So all the methods except for hash set have trim excess. All of them have a way to set or ensure, but hash set, dictionary, queue, and stack are all four are missing the ability to get the capacity.
Yeah, on the one hand, I feel like you shouldn't need to know or care what the capacity of a hash set is. I also don't even know, like, on dictionary it doesn't even make sense. Right, like it may have an ensure capacity, but the dictionary will resize if a bucket gets overweighted. It's not just because it has too much count. So like the description that they proposed with it is not sound.
I think the idea is that assuming an even distribution, the dictionary is actually okay. Because I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure the dictionary has several arrays that it uses under the covers, which are separate from the individual buckets. And those arrays hold a flat list of all of the keys and values, and then the buckets kind of point back into those arrays. I think those are the things that the capacity is controlling.
Yeah, I think that's right. So even if the buckets might get resized, there's a lot of logic that's done based on the capacity and therefore the number of elements you think the dictionary might be containing or might be able to contain.
Okay, so dictionary dot count is whether or not it's actually true in the implementation based on a flat array, and the buckets are just storing indices.
I believe that's correct. I'm double checking. Yeah, the number of buckets and the number of entries is collectively the capacity.
Weird. Okay, so if dictionary count was equal to capacity, then calling add is guaranteed to be more expensive than not guaranteed to be. It's guaranteed to be a more expensive add instead of a less expensive add. Because it'll have to resize all the stuff. I mean, again, I don't know why. I can't think of a case where anybody should ever be reading this and care, but
I mean, I think the biggest scenario is basically just adding a whole bunch of stuff to a dictionary and then saying I'm done. Like, I'm no longer going to add to us. Basically, make it read only. But I know that like Steve and friends were already talking about a dedicated type for that.
Right, but dictionary already has trim excess.
Right.
Which is, I've added everything I'm going to add to you, be as small as you can. Consider yourself in read-only. I mean, I'm going to use you in read-only mode, I hope. Like, downsize. Throw away spare memory. And, hash set saying, I've loaded you, throw away spare memory is also reasonable. But I question anybody who, like, what are you going to do based on capacity? Like, if you were going to say if capacity is less than 1,000, call ensure capacity 1,000. That's just call ensure capacity 1,000.
Right.
Right, but you can do some clever things around preemptively upsizing. based on you don't necessarily know how many are going to be added. But if you're within, say, 80% of the maximum size, then you may want to grow by your own custom amount rather than letting it implicitly grow, or rather than letting it ensure itself to whatever capacity you state you need is the next.
Fair enough.
Why would you want to do it before filling entirely? Like, why 80%? I'm just curious.
That's just an example of what's done with there's various memory allocation algorithms that use linked lists and other lists and stuff, and they typically use 80% as the marker for I'm basically at max usage. That way they have wiggle room for other operations. And so when they hit 80%, they'll either fail the allocation or do internal logic to resize, move stuff around, etc.
I was going to say, it could be you're multi-threaded or whatever, and this is your idle loop of nothing else is going on, let's do some bookkeeping while nobody's actually trying to use the system.
Right. That's basically what I was kind of referring to.
Yeah, no, the makes sense. Especially calling out that it could be a background thread.
Yeah. Sure.
So is the idea that we don't necessarily know the scenarios why people would use this, or what? Like, what would be the holdup here?
I mean, Mike, I'm just expressing the concern that it seems like it's API without scenario. But if we can say that, fine, there's a mild scenario, then as long as the type can produce it cheaply, then sure. And again, us approving the API doesn't mean that anybody has to implement it. So.
Yeah, I know I use it on list and my own version of queue and stack in my own engine. I don't have my own implementation of dictionary though, because writing dictionaries, good dictionaries, is hard. But
I don't understand this trim excess or trim excess with a load factor.
I think a load factor is an implementation detail that I don't necessarily want to expose.
Still on dictionary?
I think some of our other trim...
It's this exact guy off of dictionary.
Sorry, go ahead, Tanner.
I was going to say, I think we have another trim excess API somewhere that takes or uses a load factor, and we've discussed allowing it to be public before, and I think we rejected that particular variant, but I don't remember why.
Because I mean, you could, if the load factor is just, trim if, some percentage of entries are no longer used, then the capacity property and trim excess it takes an int collectively will do that, right?
Right.
You can have that logic yourself.
List does it at if the size is less than 90% of the actual items, then lower the capacity.
Yeah.
So with the load factor, if you are under the load factor, it still trims everything that it's able to, or does it like trim until
right? So
is it still trimming everything?
Yeah, so it's let's say you had 10 items, or let's say you had 20 items in the list, or you had a capacity of 20 with 18 items. For list, the default threshold is 90%. So if you had 18 so if you had 17 or fewer items, then trim actually trims. But if you have 18, 19, or 20 items, trim does nothing, and it will keep the capacity at 20. So it's basically just a threshold of, do I trim or do I no-op, because I'm close enough that I don't need to waste time moving stuff around.
And it trims down to the actual underlying count, correct?
Dictionary trim does not. I've got it on screen. It trims down to the...
Yeah.
The,
but you were talking about lists, though,
prime.
right? I was
Right.
curious because Tanner was talking about lists, so I was curious as to how that was.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
guess I could pull up the code.
List trims it down to exactly the number of items in the list.
So
Yes,
there'd
okay.
be no way to reduce the capacity while setting more than the count on list, or making the capacity more than the count, while simultaneously reducing it. Which, I mean, I have no idea. There's
Well,
probably no scenario for
you
that,
can just
but I'm just curious.
on list you can just set capacity.
Oh, okay.
Although
Sorry,
I don't
we're
think we
talking just
always
about-
had that.
Fair enough. On current list you can just set capacity.
Okay.
If it would be smaller than the count, then it throws, and otherwise it says, okay, it just makes a new array of that size. Dictionaries trim excess, you can tell it the minimum capacity to keep insured, and it still does the give me a prime that's bigger than that. So dictionary trim excess may do nothing, even if it has a bunch of dead space, because it doesn't care. It wants mods to be sensible. And so trim excess seems
But
to be
what
a
if I
hinty, suggestion-y thing.
what if I really wanted my dictionary to be a linked list though?
Then you can write it.
All right. So we're approved as proposed, without the load factor or anything.
Well, I mean, the question is, like, do we do trim excess? I guess trim excess with a capacity is basically ensure capacity, trim excess.
Yeah, I think for hash set, since it is a dictionary basically, it is a unique set, then the int capacity makes sense. But if we were going and then for a list, queue, and stack, none of them take a capacity, so those ones are already consistent with each other.
Does hash set have an existing? Okay, so hash set has an existing trim excess. They just want the one that takes the count to preserve. Because I was gonna ask, should we default this or add the overload that doesn't take the capacity and uses count, but that already exists. So this covers hash set and dictionary, and then Tanner, you said queue.
Yeah, queue and stack both have trim, and they both have set or ensure capacity, but they don't have get capacity.
Okay. If we're adding trim excess with a count on hash set, should we be adding trim excess with a count on queue?
It's not a bucketed thing, so I don't think it would make sense. We don't have it on stack or list, which takes account.
Well, list you can just set the capacity, so trim excess doesn't make as much sense. Like trim excess 12, you just set capacity equal to 12.
Same with Q, with set capacity, right?
Well, Q has ensure capacity.
QT has set capacity? Is that not public? Oh, just kidding. This is what I get for looking at source.net.
Yeah. So yeah, so if the capacity of the queue is, I don't know, a K, and you're like, I want you to shrink down so that you can hold 12. The only way that you could do that right now is with 2 calls, one to trim excess to shrink, and then ensure capacity to 12 to make it to grow, versus if trim excess taking account is shrink to 12 if you can.
Okay.
Right?
I guess that makes sense then.
So, I think that's why they wanted it on hash set, because otherwise it's the same thing. You could call trim excess and then ensure capacity. So they're saying, well, I don't want to shrink it then grow it. I want it to shrink down to this if it can. So I think if we're saying we would add it on hash set, we should add it on queue. And so then stack is what's left, which similarly has a trim excess and an ensure capacity, but doesn't expose capacity or have the count limit or capacity limiting trim excess. So, so I think we get this.
That makes sense to me.
Yes, that looks good.
Alrighty.
I guess we've been under quorum for a while, haven't we?
I mean, this is the 4 people of when I asked if there was just a big sale going on that made everybody leave. So, and once again, I hit post with the preview tab open, which seems to be the source of that bug. But yeah, if anybody who dropped early wants to get upset and say we actually went under quorum, then they're free to raise that objection. That's what the minutes mail's for. All right. Well, thanks for my 3 companions who are still on the call here, and the 16 people who are still with us on the internet. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for putting up with both a crypto thing and a comm thing. We're showing the Jeremys can just put everybody to sleep. And with that, it is lunchtime. We will see you all at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel, Tuesday, 10 a.m. Redmond. Auf Wiedersehen.